Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Welcome. I'm Christina Bevilacqua. I'm the Programs and Exhibitions Director at Providence Public Library.
And my name is Janae Kizzy. I'm the Events Coordinator also at Providence Public Library.
Welcome to Scandalous Conduct, Newport 1919, the enigmatic Providence Journal editor who ignited the Newport Naval sex scandal. Our presenters and stars in the cultural firmament of Providence are Matthew Lawrence and Jason Tranchida. Tonight's event is the inaugural program in PPL's 2020 exhibition and program series, The King is Dead, which focuses on how the news guides our daily activities, gives us current information, and does or doesn't relate to the facts. Tonight's event is also the inaugural program in Matthew's and Jason's year-long installation and program series, Scandalous Conduct, Newport 1919, an in-depth look at a largely forgotten but hugely important moment in the history of LGBTQ rights.
A few technical notes for tonight. As you can see, everyone is muted right now. You can feel free to type any questions in the chat. They'll go to me and me and Christina. That is Christina and I. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A with the speakers. To use the chat, it's typically through the chat bubble. If you're on Microsoft, because Zoom likes Microsoft for some reason, it'll probably be at the bottom, but just feel your way around. There are no wrong answers. As I said, because there's so many attendees tonight, we'll be doing the question and answer at the end, and they'll be coming directly through Christina. We also have closed captioning available. If you would like it, just please let me know. That'll be via a shared screen from me. And if you have any questions, feel free to send them through the chat. They go to Christina and I.
Matthew's and Jason's installation program series, Scandalous Conduct, Newport 1919, is supported by grants from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the Brown Arts Initiative, and the Arts and Cultural Alliance of Newport County. Everyone associated with this program is very grateful for all of the support without which this program would not be happening. In order to encourage further support of Matthew's and Jason's work, as well as the cultural programming at PPL, please fill out the evaluation that you get tomorrow from us. It's extremely important to all the work that everyone is doing and to our funders, so thank you.
Tonight's presenters, Jason Tranchida and Matthew Lawrence, are a collaborative team in Providence who have worked on multiple art and curatorial projects, including Headmaster, a project-based print magazine featuring original art and writing commissions. Headmaster frequently spotlights forgotten moments in gay and queer history, from an illustrated biography of singer Antonio Verocich, the first confirmed AIDS victim in Portugal, to a sculptural biography of Alan Turing, published 18 months prior to the hit film The Imitation Game that made Turing a household name. Jason and Matthew have also produced a number of curated events, including After School Special, a night of performance, and interactive sculptural work at the RISD Museum. For the inaugural PBD Fest, they received a public art grant from the Avenue Concept to produce AV Club, a looped video program screened inside a downtown gay bar. And without further ado, here are Jason and Matthew with Scandalous Conduct, Newport 1919.
Great, thank you so much, Janaea, and thank you, Christina, and everyone at the Providence Public Library for inviting us to have this talk. And we are obviously very excited to be here on Zoom. We would much rather be in the new Providence Library with you all, but that'll happen soon enough, and we're looking so forward to it. It's for those of you that don't know, the Providence Public Library just went through a huge renovation, and of course, like everything, the opening got delayed, but soon enough we'll be able to go. Also, in terms of introduction,
yeah, we are right by the train tracks. I don't know if you can hear that, but apologies for the commuter rail going by every few minutes.
So, and just in terms of introduction, because pretty much we're interchangeable, but I'm, for the record, Jason, and this is Matthew.
And Matthew. So obviously, just a warning, we've been doing this research for a while now. We'll be getting into what we're talking about, but a lot of what we were looking into did get cut off abruptly in the middle of March. So this is kind of an image-heavy presentation, but a lot of the images are literally, you know, Zoom backgrounds made from photos that we took on our phones off of photocopies in, you know, a library. So some of the images are, you know, maybe not the highest quality, but we think they'll give you a pretty good idea.
Yeah, and the way we've structured this project, it was basically in two parts. The first part was conducting research into the scandal, and then using that research for an art installation that originally was supposed to be in Newport this summer. So obviously a couple months ago we sort of retooled things like everyone did, and decided to take another year to develop the project and present it next summer. So this is actually the first sort of presentation of our research. So if it's a little rough around the edges, that's also why. So yeah, but onward to the story. Okay,
so we are talking about the Newport Naval scandal, and we'll get to that in a minute, but we just want to give you some background first. So World War I begins in 1914 in Europe. The US Navy begins kind of rapidly expanding its fleet, although the US doesn't enter the war until 2/3 of the way through. The president is Woodrow Wilson, and he has been anti-joining the war from the get-go. He ran for re-election in 1916 on a neutrality campaign and won. And the only reason that the US entered the war is really that German U-boats were sinking trade ships. And so in April 1917, the US enters the war. Now, because the U-boats are really the contentious issue, that's a lot of where the US focuses its energy. So it's a very heavily naval war in the Atlantic. And it lasts about a year and a half once the US enters. And in November 1918, an armistice is signed on November 11th, which we now call Veterans Day. And all of a sudden, all of the sailors come home. So Newport at the time was a little bit bigger than it is today, but not that much bigger. The year-round population was about 30,000 people. About 25,000 sailors come back from the war. So pretty much doubling the population of the city, but exclusively with, or almost exclusively with, young men who are, you know, 18 to 25. There's not enough housing, and sorry, we are going off of notes, so if I start looking in crazy directions, that's why. They really, the base can accommodate up to about 6,000 people stretched out, and about 25,000 come back. So they're constructing temporary housing anywhere they possibly can. There are sailors living in just about everybody's houses. So that's the scene.
Yeah, so just a little bit about this background image. That's just sort of to give you an idea. That was taken right after Newport was inundated with sailors. So just to give you an idea of the density of sailors in Newport at the time. So onward to the Spanish flu. So World War I ends at the height of a pandemic. about 100 years before this one. 1 out of 3 people around the world contracts the Spanish flu, which is spread around as the war carries it across the border. So the war actually acted as a spreader of the pandemic. 50 million people die. It's more than twice as many people that are killed in the war itself. There are about 675,000 flu deaths in the US, and in Rhode Island, there's about 2,000 to 3,500 deaths because of the pandemic. It crests in the United States in October, between October and November of 1918, just as the war is ending, and as everybody's sort of coming back. So one interesting thing, obviously, about this piece of the puzzle of our story is before, I mean, as we started our research, we knew it was starting right after a pandemic, but we were framing it more about the end of World War I. So obviously, being in a pandemic now has made us sort of like
realize being at the end of the pandemic is more all-consuming than we sort of gave it credit for.
Yeah.
One interesting thing that we did notice in our research, which is tangential, but in October and November of 1918, a lot of the newspaper headlines were saying, things will be getting better, you know, things are calming down, not so many people are dying, schools are going to reopen next week, Brown's going to reopen soon. And if you trace it, that has nothing to do with the actual reality of deaths just climbing and climbing and climbing. So seeing that sort of on the page was eye-opening, but not for maybe the best reasons.
Right. And just a few photos in the background. I believe most of these are from the Rhode Island Historical Society. This is obviously sailors in training in Newport, also training on the training grounds. And we just came, we just came across this gem a couple days ago, which is really amazing. It's a boxing match actually on a naval ship during the pandemic. So as you can see, it's not the best quality photo, but half the people are wearing masks. So it was just sort of a very poignant photo.
Some of them are wearing masks and some of them are actually using the masks.
so pretty much as it is today.
Yeah. So the next thing we want to talk about is gay life in Newport. It's a small city, but it did have a pretty active queer scene going on. I'm sorry, not that way. There was a group that called itself the Ladies of Newport, who gathered and met regularly, and they gave themselves the names of Hollywood film actresses. And it was a very kind of campy queer life that involved a lot of house parties. But they all lived somewhat, or fairly openly, which is maybe something people don't think about today. So one thing that happened as the US is entering the war, there is a sweep of all of the brothels of Newport. The police and the Navy decide that they're going to clean up the city. They want these young men not to be, you know, perverted by the prostitutes of the town. And so they clean up all the brothels and close them. And one of the things that happens is that now these 25,000 young men in a town that is dramatically short on women have nowhere to go. And so a lot of them turn sort of functionally to this queer culture that exists. Sites that were come up a lot in the research. There's a place called the Tokyo Restaurant where one of the waiters was a known member of the Ladies of Newport. Also, maybe the classier people congregated at the Newport Art Association. And additionally, there were cruising grounds, the primary one being the Cliff Walk, because it was well known but also dark, and sailors could go there, and it seems like very frequently they would meet up with servants from, you know, the Breakers or the Marble House or the other mansions that are along the water. I love this postcard. It has nothing to do with anything, but this just screams
This one, yeah.
cruising ground with Death himself. So, but the main real area that
Just I was going to add to the there was a sort of a very active theater and vaudeville scene as well, where there were a lot of vaudeville and essentially drag shows that happened as well. So this is a view of Thames Street. The Bijou Theater here was a pretty well known,
pretty popular place to go on a date.
Yeah.
So this is, for those of you that know Newport, this is Thames Street looking,
North.
I was going to say south. But this area, which is still sort of the commercial cobblestone part of Newport, is right by Washington Square, which is the park that's sort of triangular. And for today's landmarks, there's the Jane Pickens Theater on one side, and Stoneacre, the restaurant, is sort of across from it. There's also the Opera House, which opened in 1867, another popular venue, vaudeville theater at the time, showing a lot of drag performances. And across the street, which you can see in this picture, is the Army and Navy YMCA, and that's the real sort of hub of the story. So it's a Beaux-Arts building built in 1911. It operated as a YMCA until 1973, which is the same year that the Navy fully disestablished the base in Newport. Now you might know it as the McKinney Shelter, which provides emergency and transitional housing for the homeless. But at the time, it was a real hotbed of activity, and not just gay cruising activity, but it was the place to go if you wanted to hear a church service, take a class, learn a lesson. There were food things, gambling.
Pretty much everything that the village people sing about in YMCA.
Yeah,
is going on there. But it is sort of with the base being so decentralized because of housing having to be throughout the city. This became sort of a social and cultural hub as well.
Yeah, and also there were rooms upstairs, so you could find somebody there and very discreetly take them up with you. It seems pretty reasonably confirmed that the elevator operator there was also selling cocaine, which made it more fun for everybody, I guess. And this is just to show you how crowded it was. This is one, we think it's a church service that happened in the lobby.
Yeah. So just for those of you who know Newport and those who don't, here's just a quick map to sort of orientate yourself here. The naval base is here on the sort of northwest side on an island. And then just southeast of there, this is Washington Square here and the YMCA. So as you can see, it's just about a block and a half to the water here. This is Fort Adams, for those of you that know Fort Adams. And then this this here is the Cliff Walk, and where, you know, all the mansions are, you know, sort of densely here, and then sort of a little thinner here. But the beginning of the Cliff Walk, oh, I'm sorry, I'm using my mouse to point like you can see it. So this is actually First Beach, and then that's where the Cliff Walk starts.
Yeah, so all the mansions and things are right along here. So now that we've sort of given you some orientation, let's talk about the people. The one who sort of kickstarted this fiasco that you're about to learn about was Irvin Arnold. He was a petty officer, a chief machinist's mate, who came to Newport in early 1919. He had been transferred from San Francisco, had some pretty bad rheumatism, so as soon as he got here, he ends up getting sent to the hospital and is convalescing in the Newport Naval Hospital and also eavesdropping a lot. And so what he realizes is that the people working in the hospital and some of the other patients all are going out and having these homosexual experiences and sort of loudly talking about it in a way that's not really discreet at all. He is super offended by that, decides that it's his job to do something about it.
And just for the record, chief mechanist is not a high-ranking level of the Navy.
So he catches the ear of one of the doctors, whose name is Erastus Hudson, who is, and the two of them basically decide that they are going to stamp out the queer activity that's happening in Newport. They have a very strange way of going about it. They really, without any authority, gather together this group of sailors. I think it's 14 at first, and they have a secret meeting in the basement of the Naval Hospital and say, you young men, you know, just doing a great job for your country, and we have a top secret mission now that if you choose to accept it, you can, you know, really be of service to your country and a national hero. And what we want is for you to locate the gay men in the Navy, and we want you to collect evidence that they're gay. And so what they do is they pretty much immediately, I think 13 out of the 14 say yes, they're up for the mission. And they go out to the YMCA and basically start having sex with everyone, and then come back in the morning and then type notes that they turn in as official reports to Arnold and Hudson.
So just a side note on the note. So, you know, so they set up this sort of ad hoc basement office because they can't also have this on the naval base just because it's this top secret mission. And so they're literally going to off-site off of the naval base to go to this office, type up their notes, which are actually all in the National Archives right now, which when we are able to go there, we'll be able to go there and see the notes firsthand. But they're actually incredible documents. They're like very straightforward and very banal, but like very like exacting of like what happened, who they had the activity with, and then this was going to be used against them.
And also just imagine, you know, the sexual encounters that a 19-year-old boy would describe. They're all very flattering about themselves. The excerpts that we've seen are just completely fascinating.
The language is beautiful.
So ultimately, these operators work through the spring of 1919 and collect information about at least 15 sailors. Do you want to
Do you want to go to the next slide, or
Yeah.
to keep talking about the operation? Right.
So these are their names, and then one more. So the only one out of all of them that we have a photo of is Charles Zitz. He was actually discharged from the Navy first, and he went back to medical school. So this is actually his yearbook photo from the University of Michigan. Below that, we have a draft card from one of the other operators named Clyde Rudy. We followed him a little bit, and he seems to be the one that lived the gayest life after this was over. He, excuse me, he did get married, but before that, in 1930, he had moved to Los Angeles and was living with a man, and he was a decorator, which to me just...
We'll call that code.
It's code, maybe. So now, do you want to...
Yeah, so the next sort of character we want to introduce you to is Reverend Kent. And Reverend Kent is an Episcopal minister and confirmed bachelor. He relocated or located to Newport from Pennsylvania, actually, with the mission to to help the flu-stricken servicemen. And then he quite soon after that became the chaplain of the YMCA. So he was sort of like the bedrock of the community. He was, very well respected and loved by the sailors, part of the community, but also he wasn't afraid to love them back. Sailors also called him Pop. So, but more on him later. The last sort of major character to introduce, or that we'll be introducing, is FDR. So, at the time, Roosevelt was left in charge as the Undersecretary of the Navy, because the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, was in Versailles, actually ending the war and working on the treaty. He was, for the most part, stationed in D.C., although I think he would come into Newport often, or every so often. But more about him shortly as well.
Okay, so we mentioned a little bit about our research and our research getting delayed and not being able to go to the National Archives. And actually part of our grant from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities was a trip to Hyde Park to go to the FDR Library and National Library and Archive, and that's also on hold. So right now our primary source of information, although it's not a primary source in the history sense, is a book called Perverts by Official Order. It came out in 1988, and it was written by a historian named Lawrence Murphy, who unfortunately died basically when the book came out. So I think that it maybe queer nonfiction wasn't really a bestseller in 1988, but I think the book's limited reach was further limited by the death of the author. But it's a very interesting book, and what we're telling you now is just a tiny, tiny fraction of what's in there. But yeah, so until we get to the National Archives and can actually get a particular Senate inquiry, this is what we're going from, partly. Okay, so the operators are typing up these reports about the people that they're investigating, and there are some very 20th century approaches to this. So if you are a man and things are being done to you, and basically if it's oral or digital sex, or what today you would call if you're the top, then, and you're not being penetrated, then you're not gay. So a lot of the operators take the approach of, I'm just doing my job. However, it comes out eventually that some of them are participating more enthusiastically than that, and it does get into their reports. However, Arnold and Hudson are not fazed by their tactics. So they pull together all this evidence, present it to their higher ups, and starting on May 15th of 1919, sailors are court-martialed. They're thrown aboard a decommissioned ship, the USS Boxer, which is sitting in Newport Harbor. And because a lot of this is very unusual, they stay there for a long time, largely because nobody knows what to do with them. The sailors themselves don't really have any due process or rights, and nothing's explained to them. Eventually, some of their families start a letter writing campaign. There's a senator who gets involved.
And so, yeah, they're basically left on this ship for about 6 months in the harbor with zero due process.
Yeah. So one interesting part of this, and it's a short quote, but in Ted Morgan's biography of FDR, he notes that the operators actually had notations put into their service records in recognition of their interest and zeal in their work in assisting the judge advocate and in the best interests of the naval service. And Morgan goes on to say that surely this is the first time in the history of the US Navy that sailors were officially commended for committing homosexual acts. Reverend Kent, meanwhile, the case continues to build against him, and as a civilian, he's not thrown on the ship, and he's actually not arrested until May? Yeah. He's arrested and tried in a military court for immoral acts, and here's where the Navy starts to really mess up their already messed up scheme, because they actually put the operators on the stand to testify against Kent. And one, McKinney, says pretty much straight off the bat that he had sexual interactions with Reverend Kent, and he did it because he was ordered to, and he says that his instructions were to get Kent to play with my penis and to allow it to happen until I had an emission. The court is scandalized. Basically, the whole case falls apart because it's an illegal entrapment. Kent is acquitted and leaves Rhode Island. Arnold and Hudson do not learn anything when this happens, so they pretty much start the entire operation over again in a more formal way with more operators, and this time they're targeting civilians. They also go after Kent a second time, but they can't find him. So they know he's from Pennsylvania. They all jump on a train and go down there, and nobody can find him. His father, I think, lives in Massachusetts. They go up there. He's not there. Eventually, they track him down in Battle Creek, Michigan, at the health spa that is owned by John Hervey Kellogg of the Kellogg's Cornflake fame. And that is a completely different crazy story.
Whole different project, but
which
you know,
we highly recommend that you get it.
Google it, it's amazing.
Yeah.
The whole philosophy of the place is incredible.
Yeah. So basically they do eventually find Kent, bring him back to Rhode Island. and there is a second trial. And mind you, we're vastly simplifying what happens in the interests of time, because we could keep you here for days, but hopefully won't. So Kent's second trial is in Providence. It's a federal trial. And at that trial, many of the ministers of Newport come to testify in his defense. There are 14 character witnesses, clergy, friends, respected people of Newport. The operators are put on the stand again and basically torn apart for their tactics, for their bad memories, for just being awful people, even though they were ordered to do this, and they really were, many of them were teenage boys.
So meanwhile, just to add in the sort of chain of command here as well, you had these guys running this operation, but it did trickle up through the military. FDR was aware of the scheme and the entrapment scheme. It's unclear if he or sort of the people directly below him knew of the tactics that they were using to actually, go after the gays in the military. So that's this, there's sort of debate going back and forth of who knew what. But it's safe to say that Daniels, who was the Secretary of the Navy, was a bit of a Puritan, and this would have actually been something that he would have been fully behind. So there was this sort of trickle up and trickle down, like sort of, okay, we know about it, but we don't need to know what you're doing or how you're doing it. Just take care of it. And meanwhile, these the cases are happening and sort of exploding the entire story.
Yeah, just do a time check.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to go on to?
Yes, so now finally, at long last, we are up to John Rathom,
The man
who
of
is
the
the
hour.
subject of our conversation tonight.
So just some facts about John Revelstoke Rathom, and he's the editor of the Providence Journal at the time. He's an Australian. He's traveled around a lot. He held newspaper posts all over the country. He arrived in Providence in March of 1906 and became the managing editor of the Projo. But he basically walked in as sort of a reporter and was given the job of managing editor because recently, Rhode Island history, that the Pawtucket newspaper had just stolen away a lot of their writers and the staff from the Providence Journal. So he sort of quickly rose to the top. He was promoted to full editor in 1912. Simultaneously, he's also sort of, through his connections throughout the country, he's also one of the directors of the Associated Press. I have a great photo here. So here, he was a newspaper maker of note, along with many other older white gentlemen. So his reach and the importance of the Projo at the time is actually pretty significant. And so simultaneously, he's also doing a lot of speaking engagements around the country and is a man of many, many opinions. He also is a total newspaper. He wants to sell newspapers. He's all about selling newspapers at any cost. So that's his sort of his MO. And then as far as the Naval scandal goes, prior to this, the Projo has been very supportive of World War I and the United States involvement in it. So at the beginning of the Naval scandal, however, his coverage was a bit limited, but soon it becomes a front page story, and it's almost daily. Like, let me find the other photo. So there's, he's following the trial like super, super closely and giving it a lot of real estate in the Projo. And he's so sort of involved in the story that he actually testifies in Reverend Kent's trial. And then he also, he is the one that sort of rallied other Newport ministers to demand an apology from the Navy to Ken.
After trying and acquitting him twice.
Him twice, right.
So one, so Rathom, sorry, I lost my own place there for a second. So Rathom, earlier, a couple of years before that, got to be really good at selling newspapers and promoting himself as a news source. So he would write these very emotional stories about the war, editorials about the war, and then he got really active on the speaking circuit. So he would be big enough that when he went to Detroit, for instance, the Detroit Free Press ran his picture on the front page, even though you can see that there are 4,000 people dead in Halifax and torpedoes killing people on a destroyer and all of this other stuff. He really is a sort of celebrity. Excuse me. The reason he is such a celebrity is that he tells these fantastic stories about the Providence Journal's ability to intercept German intelligence, to place its own reporters undercover in European embassies, all sorts of kind of exciting, sexy spy stuff that is almost completely fabricated, and what's not fabricated is certainly not his doing. Some of the information was planted probably by British intelligence.
Yeah, it kind of went both ways. He was a bit, people knew that if they got in his ear that he would disseminate it.
He would disseminate it and also turn it into a story about himself. So there was no indication that he would say, you know, my sources tell me. It was more, I sent my reporters here to. So his sort of lying and scheming builds and builds and builds until early 1918, and he gets a one-year commission to write a series of articles for a magazine that's called The World's Work. That is about, you know, the Providence Journal's heroic exploits in fighting off the Germans single-handedly. In the very first issue, he tells a story about Germans who planted a bomb in his own office to silence him. Just wild and completely imaginary stories. So once the first issue runs, the Department of Justice gets involved and says, you know, hey, we'd like some evidence of these stories that you're telling about our military. Because also the sort of the subplot of all of this is the Providence Journal and the Providence Journal staff are so great at intercepting German intelligence, and the Navy is completely inept and can't do it themselves, even though that's their job. So Rathom has this sort of vendetta against President Wilson about his appointed Secretary of the Navy, Daniels, and by extension, FDR, the Undersecretary of the Navy. So what you realize after a while is that Rathom's sort of endless pursuit of justice in the Samuel Kent case and the Newport Navy scandal really has nothing to do with any sense of justice or heart or, you know, sensitivity towards gay people. Persecuted. It's really just to get back at FDR.
Yeah. So obviously everything that Rathom says and does has to be taken with a grain of salt. So we sort of devised a little game here called John Revelstoke Rathom, true or false?
And in the interest of time, we're just going to play it with each other.
True or false, Matthew? John Revelstoke Rathom was born on July 4th, 1868 in Melbourne, Australia.
That sounds believable. I'll say true.
False. Rathom was born in Australia and claimed that he was born on the 4th of July, but according to a 2004 Providence Journal article by Mark Arsenault, private investigators later found no trace of anyone with that name being born in Melbourne that day. Side note, according to Ancestry.com, John Rathom's 1910 birthplace is actually listed as Antarctica and not Australia.
Okay, Jason, question for you. True or false? After returning from the Spanish-American War in 1898, Rathom gets malaria and escapes from a quarantine camp on Long Island.
Sounds feasible to me.
Probably not. According to the 1920 biographical history of the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, which is our state's name for those of you who maybe aren't from here, Rathom was sent to Cuba in 1898 as a correspondent for the Spanish-American War and was badly wounded in the campaign. While recovering from his wound, he was attacked by yellow fever and sent back to the United States. In the meantime, his death had been reported in many American newspapers. On reaching New York, he was attacked by malarial fever and was held at Montauk, from which camp he escaped at night, walked 10 miles to Amagansett, and took a train to New York City, where he collapsed again and was taken to St. Luke's Hospital. We have our doubts.
Matthew, true or false? Rathom spent 4 years in the Chinese Navy and then authored a book aptly titled 4 Years in the Chinese Navy.
I'm starting to have my doubts.
Who knows? Writing about Rathom frequently mentions the 1892 book, though we have yet to find any proof that the book actually exists, other than in title only, of his stint in the actual Navy or the book.
All right, Jason, did Rathom cover for his mistress when she faked her own attempted murder?
Of course he did.
Yeah. So John and Mary Rathom were married in 1890, and the marriage soon soured, maybe because Mary knew that John was having an affair with her friend Florence Campbell. Florence took an envelope from a letter that Mary had written her, pasted the address onto a box of arsenic-laced cherries, and sent it to herself. Florence ate some of the untainted cherries in front of her landlady, but convinced herself that she had eaten the wrong cherries and was poisoned. When she went to the pharmacy and asked for an arsenic antidote, the pharmacist got suspicious and called the police. Rathom swore that neither his wife nor his mistress sent the poisoned box of cherries, though ultimately Florence did confess.
And go on to be the second wife.
Yes.
Matthew, true or false? Rathom is buried in Swan Point Cemetery here in Providence with a stone that simply says, Boss.
Well, I can see it right there. It must be true.
False. The Boss family grave is very close to Rathom's grave, which is unmarked. He died in 1923 and is buried alone.
Right there.
Bonus question. Is this an actual photo of his unmarked grave that we took 2 days ago?
Yes.
Congratulations.
Okay, so a little bit more about Rathom. I was going to read you a thing, but we're maybe a little short on time, but he just was very good at talking about himself. We'll just keep it short. So when Rathom arrived in Providence in 1906, he brought with him his mistress, Florence Campbell, who you just heard about with the cherry incident. They had both worked for the San Francisco Chronicle in the 1890s. Eventually, John divorced his first wife, Mary, who went back to Canada and married Florence a few years later. much to the surprise of everyone in Providence who thought that they were already married. They lived in the Cushing Apartments, which were the first modern apartment building in Providence. If you live here now, that's the U-shaped colonial building that's now Brown Dorms at the corner of Thayer and Bowen, next door to the Insomnia Cookies. And later they bought a house at 89 Brown Street at the corner of Brown and Meeting, which is not there because it's the patio outside of the Warren Alpert Center. So if you live in Rhode Island and there's any chance that you know the name John Rathom, it's because of the Boy Scouts. Weirdly, the one sort of trace of a soul that this man has is that he is an early advocate for Boy Scouts, to the point where Camp Yagug in Hopkinton still to this day has the Rathom Lodge, which is a dining hall, which features this plaque over the fireplace. We tried to visit the lodge back in March and were politely told to maybe try again in a few months after things reopen. But if you're interested, you can see what the camp looks like in the movie Moonrise Kingdom from 2011. So just to wrap things up, do you want to talk about where everybody went?
Sure. Well, just to sort of, as a bit of an epilogue here. So Arnold disappears, but he does write a memoir in the 20s. Also, we haven't quite located that yet.
We just can't get to it.
Right. Hudson later becomes a minor celebrity who was originally who had sort of launched this plan. He was the fingerprint expert in the Lindbergh baby trial. So I don't know if you'll remember that photo. He was next to a large fingerprint, and that's why. Reverend Kent is never given another congregation and retires from the ministry with the only brief stint in the 1930s as a chaplain on a cruise ship. Daniels is out as Secretary of the Navy in 1921 when Warren Harding appoints a new naval secretary. FDR quits the Navy for a run as vice president under James Cox of Ohio. They lose in a landslide, some say due to Rathom's writings about him, taking only 11 of the 50 states and only getting 24% of the electoral votes. The next year he contracts polio, is confined to a wheelchair, and later becomes the only three-term president in American history. As for the imprisoned sailors, all are gradually released from military prison in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Their terms are reduced via presidential pardons on a sort of gradual one-by-one basis, which happens right before Christmas every year. But you can't probably put too fine a point on it that this sort of lives of these young men were affected because of this.
Forever, yeah. So now we're going to talk about our project for a few minutes, just to give you some context for everything we just told you.
Yeah, so a little bit about how we sort of stumbled upon this story, and we, as I believe Janaea introduced, publish a magazine called Headmaster. It's a visual arts magazine that we write assignments for artists to do original projects in each issue. So it's a queer art magazine. So a lot of the assignments are also around sort of unknown pieces of queer history that we ask artists to sort of investigate and do a project around. So as we sort of, this came across our radar in a few different ways, but as we started to do research, we realized that it wasn't an assignment we wanted to give to another artist. We actually wanted to dig deeper and do something with it. And it was a fantastic article by the author and scholar Sherry Zane out of UConn, who wrote an article called "I Did It for the Uplift of Humanity and the Navy." She tells the story just so much more beautifully than and eloquently than we just did. And but also what is so fantastic about it is she really threads this story through to present day as sort of the beginning of the story of gays in the military and the security state. And I'll let Matthew take it from here.
Yeah, so so a couple of sort of things that we're keeping in mind. So we did learn about the story a couple of years ago, and we wanted to originally do something in 2019. And what we realized very early on in 2019 is that that was the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. And this is a story that we wanted to get out into the world to a more general audience. And we really, with the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, thought that nobody would care about the 50th anniversary of the 50th anniversary of a scandal that people didn't really remember. So last year seemed like a bad time to do it. So we thought that 2020 would be the year to do a giant public art project. But it turns out that that was also not in the stars. So summer of 2021, we're going to be doing something on some scale in Newport, in the city of Newport, during the summer when there are lots of people there. We're very committed to actually siting it in Newport, which for those of you who, it's funny because in the chat window I can see certain people and I don't think any of them are actually in Rhode Island, but so Newport and Providence are about 45 minutes apart, but culturally they're very, 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 very different places. With very different people who do not like to cross bridges one way or the other. So we're excited that we get to work with the Arts and Cultural Alliance of Newport County on this project, and we've also met some great people in Newport along the way. One other thing I want to say about this concept is that we gave you a very sort of quick-ish overview of the story, but one thing that's really kind of jumps out over and over again is that there are not good and bad people in this story. There are people, you know, entrapping deviant behavior or entrapping queers committing deviant behavior, but those people are also being taken advantage of by a system and sort of by this like middle management doofus machinist mate. And also it's a really unusual story because you have Reverend Kent, who is maybe sleeping with probably sleeping with the sailors, and he has this whole sort of congregation's the wrong word, but he has this whole sort of cohort of other ministers in Newport who immediately jump to his defense and sort of circle around to protect him. And so it's an unusual situation where there's a clergy, you know, having gay sex and being protected by other ministers, but he's actually the good guy. And so there's just really
it's a very rich and intricate story.
Yeah, and oh, sorry.
Oh no, I'm good.
So what has happened in the last 10 years is that a really interesting literature about the Newport Naval scandal has popped up. I want to reiterate again that when we learned about this, you know, I grew up in Rhode Island, I'm gay, I'm in my late 30s. I had never heard of this before. And I do geek out on nerdy history things. So that was sort of mind-blowing. And then we talked to other people, and they hadn't heard of it either. So originally, our introduction to the scandal was that in 2017, an artist that we had worked with on Headmaster had told us about an artist named Brian Arthurs, who in 2016 had done a project called Masculine Decoys. We can type his name in the chat or something, and you should look it up later. But they're antique photos of sailors that he then silk screens with floral patterns and using these sort of interesting things that are based on signal flags and pennants. So that was sort of how we heard about it, and it was sort of like, what is this thing
The
that
story that we
someone
should
that's
know
not
about.
from here is telling us about? So then from there, we started doing some reading, and we discovered that there are 2 plays about the scandal that have been written in the last 10 years. One of them was commissioned by someone that we know, and we hadn't heard of that one either. In 2015, there's a comedy podcast called The Dollop that is popular that had done a whole episode about the Newport Navy scandal. In the process of figuring out who in Newport we wanted to tell about the story, we reached out to the Newport Out people that put on Newport Pride, and we sent sort of a blind email to Sean and Daniel, and Sean O'Connor, who is half of Newport Out, wrote back and said, that's really funny. I'm already writing a screenplay about this scandal. So, and then the craziest thing that has happened in forever happened last Friday when I opened my email and was reading the local news stories of the week. And last Friday, there was an announcement that Mark Arsenault, the former Providence Journal reporter, is just announced a book-length work biography of John Rathom, who is apparently very in demand. 78 people are listening to this right now, which is crazy to me.
So for further reading on Rathom, there's a book forthcoming.
Yeah.
So we can build from there. So from there, while we're not exactly ready, or nor do we know exactly what we're going to be presenting next year as we sort of develop the project, we are researching some themes. And I don't know if you read the slide at the beginning that mentioned a beanstalk, and we didn't forget about the beanstalk. And so Jack and the Beanstalk was basically a very extravagant musical production produced by the Navy, essentially a drag performance, and used as a marketing tool to recruit young men to the Navy. So Jack and the Beanstalk, let's see here. Jack and the Beanstalk opens in Newport in May 1919, so simultaneously while this whole scandal is going on. And just also that Providence, that ad of it coming to Providence was interesting because that was actually side by side with an article about
the Kent trial.
About the Kent trial. So, and I don't think it was a mistake that they were run so closely together. So back to this slide. This is actually in the Naval magazine.
Yeah, the Newport Recruit, which is the Navy's.
And so it's basically
magazine.
And you know, these are all just to give you some details. Jack and the Beanstalk opens in Newport with a cast of 125 and a 25-piece orchestra offering classy music and the latest hit song. So this is like a no small production. and it actually toured around mostly New England. There was a big stint in New Bedford and sort of, I believe, in upstate New York. But basically this went around and it was used as recruitment for new naval sailors. This is another article, but it's one of features in musical extravaganza with all naval cast from Newport training station. The ferries are left to right: Stephen Rowland, John Donko, Hugh Quinn, and Richard Ryle. I don't know if you remember the slide. Let me go back here. But actually some of the entrapped were actually in this production. So that's sort of one theme that we're going to be exploring as a sort of like drag show as a marketing tool, or using drag to actually entrap. The way me personally, I was thinking about this story is in a, at first in a very sort of like chew gum vaudevillian way. Because you have these sort of clumsy officers like starting this whole scandal in sort of spite of themselves. But then the more I thought about it, I've started thinking of it as more of an operatic story. So this is actually a Wagner
Dutchman.
From the Dutchman. So basically, there's a pandemic, there's a world war, there's persecution of homosexuals, there's systematic destruction of their lives, there's presidential aspiration, and there's a huckster newspaper editor that sort of acts as a narrator of this whole thing. So that's another theme that we'll be exploring.
Yeah, so just, we should get to the questions in a second, but just a couple last things. We are also interested in the idea of war rooms and strategy and gaming tables and that kind of thing. This photo on the bottom is actually from the Newport Naval War College, but in 1894. Also, we're looking a lot in our research. We've sort of become taken with sailor imagery in popular culture and film, and sort of the fetishization of the sailor. Tom of Finland is sort of the most obvious inspiration. The Village People is sort of a funny one because one thing we didn't mention, the last issue of Headmaster, which came out in 2017, actually was completely Village People themed. And even though their biggest hits were YMCA and in the Navy, we still did not come across the story of the Newport sex scandal at all. Also, movies like On the Town with Frank Sinatra and Gene Kelly, and then more overtly queer movies like Corel, the Fassbender movie from 1982 that was based on the work of Janae. So that is, that's our talk, right?
I think there was one more movie.
Oh yes, that's what we're wrapping up with.
And Gene Kelly once again.
So I know we ran a little long, but
thanks for sticking with us.
Yes.
We appreciate it.
And I think Christina is gonna have some questions now. If people
Yeah, I have some questions, and I'm not sure, do you guys also have any in your, I think questions were going various places, but while you're checking just to see.
Oh, sure.
We do have a, no, we don't.
Okay. So the first, in the tradition of talking and questions, this is not a question, but this is an astute comment. Rathom's manipulation via his newspaper seems uncannily contemporaneous, as if Rathom, as newspaper editor, prefigures Rush Limbaugh and invented Fox News a century ago. Plus ça change.
Yes.
Then there was a question, Do you think that the entrapped sailors got to fraternize together on the prison ship for 6 months?
Oh, well, that's funny.
Unfortunately, no.
Yeah, they were essentially in solitary confinement, and they were actually also sort of being watched for any activity like that that could just additionally be used against them.
Yeah, it was basically, you know, a summer in a hot, probably moldy, decommissioned ship that's out in the middle of the harbor. Everybody in their own quarters, and I believe, I don't quote me on this, I think there was also like a ringworm outbreak at some point because they were being given bad food, or
yeah, and there was actually a lot of they were evidently allowed to write letters because family members did know what was going on, and there was a father of one of the sailors did a letter writing campaign and does mention that like his son had ringworm and they were malnourished, and again like the sort of response was like, we're busy. So
And then in the other direction, what effect, if any, did the Gilded Summer residents have on this scandal?
so probably not too much. There is a parallel sort of upper crust gay culture in Newport as well. There are people like Ogden Codman, who is the architect who designed the breakers and was friends with Edith Wharton, and that crowd was really focused around the art association. I'm sure that there was maybe some crossover here and there, but not a huge part of the story. One thing that did happen, though, is that the Cliff Walk was a cruising ground for the many, many servants who lived, worked for the Gilded Glass set.
Do you think that the coincidence of the 2020 pandemic and the 1918 flu pandemic has altered or will alter your project's trajectory aside from just the timing?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. You know, the last 2 months obviously have been strange. And then in just sort of us talking about and figuring out what we're going to do with this project, which was, you know, we had actually left what we're going to do with our project rather fluid, just because we weren't sure where exactly it was going to be sited in Newport. And right about the time of the pandemic started, we were actually figuring that out. So the project was sort of starting to take shape. So obviously it's going to take, that's going to happen all over again. And just from, you know, I think I had mentioned earlier, we had done research and knew that the pandemic was like a part of the story, but we had that here, and then we were like, but we're kind of framing it with the end of World War I. So I think the pandemic also is making us reframe or rethink about certain things in the story. So I think, yeah, surely it'll do something.
Yeah, so mentally thinking, you know, oh, there was a pandemic in November of 1918, but the story doesn't really start until the spring of 1919. You know, I guess it's kind of related. And now that we're in the third month of an actual pandemic, it's like, oh no, if there was a pandemic last November, we would still all be thinking about it constantly, and, you know. But yeah, so one thing we should mention is that because of the delay, we did get a community grant from the Brown Arts Initiative, who specifically set up this grant program for artists in Rhode Island whose work had been affected by the pandemic. And they're offering a year of institutional support and some other things. We just got the grant, so we don't know every detail. But,
yeah, and kind of the exciting part of that, actually, there's 10 recipients of this grant who are all doing amazingly interesting projects, and so we'll get to sort of interact with them, and it'll be a great sounding board, a great group of people to use as a sounding board to kind of develop this, to develop the project, and also institutional support from Brown, will be fantastic. So, and then part of what we'll do is also sort of do outreach with students and, groups at Brown who are interested in this story.
Somebody pointed out that Randy Schultz maybe discussed this scandal in Conduct Unbecoming, although the person points out that that was 30 years ago, so we might not have that at the tip of our brains, but
yeah.
Another question, great discussion on Rathom. You mentioned that he printed Providence Journal stories given to him by British intelligence agents. Was there any evidence that the Brits paid the Providence Journal to print those?
Oh, interesting.
Not that I'm aware of, but I wouldn't say no.
Yeah.
What they did definitely do is offer him an opportunity to promote their goals in an extremely self-aggrandizing way. I don't know if there was money actually involved, but that's a good question.
I mean, there was money involved in that he was able to sell more papers, I suppose. But yeah, that's a very interesting question.
Somebody else wanted to know, in your research, did you run across any resistance from the military or any resistance to getting, was there any classified material that you couldn't see?
So we,
it's funny story. We actually, 2 months ago, do you remember the date? It's like February. Anyway, the last place that we did research was at the Naval War College Archives. And they were.
Oh, it was Friday the 13th.
That's right. Oh, that's right.
March,
Yeah, I knew there was a reason why I remember that date. And so Friday the 13th, we are working with the archivist down there who's pulling some great source material for us. And then we also met with a scholar there who actually knows a lot about the story. And so instantly he was like, I'd love to talk to you guys and, see what your take is. And he also works with the Naval History Museum. So they were amazingly supportive. But literally while we were there, they were getting emails and phone calls that today was their last day before quarantine. So they, and someone just looked at us and was just like, if you need something, take a photo now because we don't know when we're going to get back in here to be able to scan it for you or whatever. So it was a really weird and eerie thing. But the Naval War College was extremely, extremely supportive so far. And
yeah, and other than that, all of our research has been local. We've been to the Newport Historical Society, the Rhode Island Historical Society, Newport and Providence Public Libraries. The one place that we didn't get, we actually got in and said, hey, do you have this thing? And they said yes, and we said, okay, we'll come back and make an appointment. Was the Rhode Island State Archive that is downtown on Westminster Street, because they actually have, Kate Wells at Providence Public Library tipped us off that they have the handwritten Newport police logs from that era. Yeah, the police blotters, which would have had all the stuff about the brothel sweeps and the raid that happened in the summer of 1919. But we've been told maybe not to fully announce what we're doing to the FDR library, but that information might also be older. So we'll find out. Hopefully things have gone smoothly so far.
Did the church ever do any investigation of Reverend Kent?
No.
No.
How, this is a question I had, and maybe
Yeah.
I just missed it. How were they allowed to go after civilians? Why were the civilians in there?
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Because the Naval College actually, hold on, let me find the map. Go away, mouse. The Navy actually had jurisdiction over a 10-mile radius during wartime.
Okay.
So basically from, oh my God, I'd make a horrible weatherman. From the naval base to say the cliff walk is maybe
4?
not even, no, it's like 2 miles. I think it was 1.9 to here. So definitely they had jurisdiction over the entire island at the time. So.
Yeah, so it's a 10-mile radius during wartime and for up to, I want to say, a year after the war. So they basically can, if they can convince the city to conduct arrests, then they sort of have authority over the whole. Probably the whole island. I don't know.
It was definitely the whole
10 miles.
10 miles. I measured it and it was well into Portsmouth. So.
To what extent do you know what the long-term impacts were on any of the soldiers' lives, considering that we presume they had dishonorable discharges, reputational damages, that kind of thing?
Sure.
Yeah, we don't know, and unfortunately, you know, they scattered all over the place. They were from all over, and we haven't had the time or the.
Yeah, we'd almost have. We did start to sort of track one of them, but like in a lot of the research other folks have done before us, there's like that one photo of Ziff, only because that was like a med school yearbook photo. We were starting to sort of pull up some draft cards and things like that we were able to.
Yeah, we were going through census records, but the census publicly stops at 1940 right now, so we're not too sure. And also, one book that really doesn't. It mentions the Newport scandal, but that really gave us some good context is by James Polchin, and it's called Indecent Advances. I think it came out last year, and it is about crimes against gay men in the years before Stonewall, so 1920 to 1969. And the interesting thing that it does is it analyzes newspaper reports from the big cities where these crimes happen and also from the hometowns of these people. So what you realize is that, you know, there's not a story that is gay man is murdered in hotel room by trick. It's you know, man who is in the park asks another man for a match, and then they decide that they want to play a game of cards together, so they go back to the hotel room and tell the desk that, you know, they're co-workers, and then they go upstairs, and then several hours later, one of them is found dead with no pants on.
So it's all this amazing sort of coded language, which is actually something else that we've been like interested as we're doing research. Just like, well, what was funny about the sort of naval the operators' reports is that they were very it wasn't even coded, like it was very straightforward, which was interesting. But then reading about other things that and you know newspapers that write about it and the coded language of you know what this meant, and it might seem not obvious to us, but probably at the time a lot of it was completely obvious to everyone, like, you know, what that meant.
Yeah, asking somebody for a match in the park meant not asking somebody for a match in the park. So things like that make it harder to look into private lives of people. Also, just because they're so scattered, and that would be a great path to go down.
Yeah,
but I don't know if we'll be able to.
So we have one more question. There's a novel by Christopher Bram called Hold Tight that follows the same storyline, but it's set in World War II instead of World War I. Did you see anything in your research that suggested that he was inspired by the Newport sex scandal?
I'm
No, I
not
don't.
familiar with it, actually. So we will add that to our reading list. And
Yeah, that does remind me,
Thank you.
when I was listing cultural products related to the Newport scandal, there was also a novel in 2014 called Uncertainty, I want to say.
yeah,
Spacing right now.
Gotcha.
And that really focuses on Reverend Kent and this fictitious lawyer that gets involved with the case.
So that's it for our discussion. Thank you, Matthew and Jason. We're so excited to hear the beginnings of this. Can't wait for the rest of the discoveries and installations and programs and everything. Please keep us posted, and we'd love to have you back in real life if that becomes possible.
Yeah.
And thank you so much to everybody who joined us and for your great comments and questions. Janaea, do you want to just mention the program we have coming up next week or in June?
Yes, on June 4th.
You're muted.
On June 4th, we're going to have the program Voices of Queer Rhode Island, an oral history listening party. That's going to be on Zoom from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. and you can register on the link that I just put up in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks,
Awesome.
everybody.
Thank you again for having us. This was fantastic. And
Yeah.
thank you all for taking your valuable Zoom time.
Thursday evening,
Thursday evening Zoom time with us. We aren't the only Zoom game in town, so we appreciate it.